Sports for Real with Coach Hall. Last night, I dropped a video on the first time Emmitt Smith played in Jacksonville. I had a little trouble getting it out like I wanted to, so I'm going to put a link in the description for the video. But it's basically a history lesson on how all the great athletes from the area tie together. Emmitt Smith, he played for the Florida Gators, but his first trip to Jacksonville wasn't against the Georgia Bulldogs. It was against the Lee Generals. And last night, I went to the game at Lee, and if you are aware of Lee, they changed the name to Riverside, and along with the change, and they're one of the first schools to do so, they had their field completely remade over. So it's like turf. If you hadn't been there in 10 or more years, then you probably wouldn't recognize the place. But a very beautiful facility, and I can't wait to see how it's going to turn out with all the other public high schools, when they get their field redone. But the point I wanted to make, I dropped nugget after nugget after nugget on the history of football in the Northeast Florida area. So again, Smith came to town in 1984 for the second round against the #1 ranked Generals. And the game ended up going to 4 overtimes. But before I get to recapping how it ended again, let me tell you about Smith. Smith was a sophomore at the time, and he was averaging 211 yards a game when he played. Now, I say when he played because he missed 2 games, and in those 2 games, it caused his average to drop to a measly 179 yards a game. Well, Lee had a rugged defense, and of course, they had to stop Smith. Well, the first time Smith touched the ball, he ran for 33 yards, and he ended up with 71 yards in the first half. But the rest of the game, he only got 25 more. He ran for 34 carries and 96 yards. That is one of the lowest, if not the lowest, totals of Emmitt Smith's entire football career. And they stuffed him right there in the backyard. But anyway, I say the game went to 4 overtimes, and it's really because of Lee. Lee's was the better team. But they had a problem all year long with penalties. And they had a reliable field goal kicker who missed a whole bunch of kicks that night. He missed 2 field goals in regulation. He missed the extra point he missed the extra point also in regulation. And then in overtime, he missed 2 field goals. The second one was at the beginning of the 4th overtime. And instead of just trying to run a play, Escambia just ran the kicker out, kicked the field goal, and they escaped with a 28-25 victory in 4 overtimes. Now, granted, the week before they played at Capitol Stadium against Rickers, and they won that game in 3 overtimes, 26-23. So sometimes things just go your way. The next 2 games that they played, they went down to Bartow, and there wasn't no overtime affair that time. And then they got St. Pete High in Pensacola this time. Then they had to get back on the road for the 4th straight week. This time St. Pete had to go up there, and they got demolished 47-14. And that was the first championship that Emmitt Smith won. He came back and won it again the second year, back in '86 as a junior. He didn't win, well, in '85 as a junior, but in '86 he didn't win it. But another note about the '85 season I talked about, this was, Lee ended up winning the district again for the 9th straight year, even after the association tried to pack it with a whole bunch of other teams that's used to winning. So what ended up happening was they hosted the first round game at the backyard where I was last night. They played against Ocala Forest. Forest lost their running back, but before that, Lee had jumped out to a 21-0 lead. Then later on, they lost their running back. In came sophomore Vince Woodbury. I ended up meeting him because we used to run track, and you get to know some of the guys you run track against. So I knew Woodbury. He's a year older than me. He came in as a sophomore running back, and for whatever reason, Forrest caught fire, and he came back and won the game 22-21. Forrest that year was 10-0. So that gave them 11-0 now. Emmitt Smith, again, had to come back down to Panhandle, this time to Booster Stadium in Ocala. I had this little radio that I heard the Lee Forest game. I heard that on the radio, so that's how I was able to understand what was going on. Then the next week, I also caught the Forest Escambia game. And the reason was able to do that is because where I'm from, we're in an area that's kind of like Jacksonville's an hour Daytona's an hour, and Gainesville's less than an hour, and Orlando's an hour and a half. So it was in a good media market where I could track all of these different things. Well, anyway, I was close enough to Ocala to catch the game, and Forest ended up losing 35-21, and it wasn't that close. But the thing I pointed out in the video was that night is the first and only time you ever had a reference between Emmitt Smith and John L. Williams. If you know who John L. Williams is, he was at the University of Florida up until 85, and he wore number 22. I don't know who wore number 22 in 86, but when Smith got there, he got the number. So this particular night, when the game, they have to find filler information, the guy said that Smith looks like he reminds you of John L. Williams. It looks like he's not doing much, but at the end of the night, he's got 200 yards. And that's the first and only time I ever heard those two guys connected. But there are a lot of connections, as I pointed out in the video. First of all, they both went through Lee to win a championship. My school won that championship in 81, and the first round playoff was at the backyard against Lee. Then they went to Tallahassee to take on Leon at Capitol Stadium. Okay? Smith did the reverse of that. His first round game against Rickards was in Capitol Stadium. Then they went to Lee for the second round game. Then they both had the same number at Florida, and they played against each other in the NFL, most notably in Super Bowl 30. If you remember that game, that's when Neil O'Donnell went crazy and started throwing to the wrong color uniform. Larry Brown, for instance, I guess he liked him, picked him off twice, and which was really the difference in that game. But the second time he picked him off, he got knocked out of bounds. It was by John L. Williams, who was playing for the Steelers at that time. So there's connection after connection after connection. But the biggest point I wanted to make, and nobody has ever said this, not ESPN, nobody, that on the night Emmitt Smith came to Jacksonville to play in that 1984 playoff game, on the opposite sideline as a junior was Leroy Butler. So what did I just say to you? Future Hall of Famer Emmitt Smith played against future Hall of Famer Leroy Butler in a high school playoff game, and that is one of the few, if any, notable occurrences where two future Hall of Famers played against each other in high school. If you know of any instances, let me know, because I am not aware of it. But I just told you something that has never been heard upon by ESPN or any other news outlet, and this game occurred on November 30th, 1984 at the backyard of Jacksonville, Florida. Now, the thumbnail that I put out on that video also was Hall of Fame related. That was Leroy Butler and Reggie White trying to tackle Emmitt Smith. Green Bay at Dallas. I don't know what year it was, but they had those playoff wars a couple years in a row in the early 90s. Of course, Dallas won, but they always, they could beat Green Bay. But on that particular play, you had three Hall of Famers in one shot. Nobody ever said anything about that. We know we just had the Hall of Fame ceremony a couple weeks ago. They do it every summer, but nobody ever makes references to how many times Hall of Famers have played against each other in high school, and it can't be too many shots out there where you have so many Hall of Famers in one shot going against each other. So check the link out if you want to hear the video. I left out a lot of information there. I just put in some about Emmitt Smith, and I think it's worth listening to. But like I said, it's the first known occurrence that you had two future Hall of Famers who played against each other in high school. Sports for real.